It is 3:30. We'll go ahead and get started today. I want to say thank you for joining us for today's LTC webinar series session. My name is Brian Bates. I'm the Director of Professional Learning for the LTC. I'm also joined by my colleague, Matt Jacobson, who is the Online Learning Coordinator, who will help out with some of the moderation and the chat and helping out in the background. Just a couple things before we get kicked off with today's session. First, we are recording today's webinar. It'll be available on the LTC's YouTube channel in about a day or two after we get it downloaded and buffered up and then put up onto the YouTube channel. So you can go check it out there along with all of our other recordings from past webinars. If you would like to interact today with the presenter, please feel free to use the chat box. If you would, make sure that you've selected everyone or to all panelists and attendees. So that way everybody can see the question you're asking or see what comments you're making so that we can all learn from each other during today's session. Finally, if you're interested in receiving PD credit for attending today's webinar, you will receive an email tomorrow with an evaluation for attending the live session this afternoon. So without further ado, I want to turn it over today to our webinar presenter, Steve Wick. So Steve, when you're ready, go ahead and take over.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm going to put in the chat real quick, the direct link to, but it's also up here on the screen to this presentation, and that has everything that you will need. So if for some reason we get cut off or put out, that's where it is. But it is that bit.ly there also, and that is LTC. I broke one of my rules there and used an L. Sometimes that gets confused with a 1, but I didn't think about it until after I put it up there, and I hate wasting bit.ly links once I've made them. So this webinar is all about applied digital skills, which is a real easy to use resource created by Google. So super powerful, super quick. It can be used in a variety of different ways. So let's get rolling with this and go through this. I wanted to say first, I know there's not a lot of us here right at the beginning, but if you're watching this later or anything like this, know that I'm talking to you too. I appreciate you. I know how hard it is right now for most of us to continue to survive as teachers. And we were talking about this earlier before this started, and also start to grow and continue to grow as teachers. It's a struggle. It's a struggle for me. And that's something that I've always loved about teaching. So I appreciate all of you. I want to thank you for taking the time to take a look at this, and know that I'm always here for you if you ever have any questions or there's anything that I can do to help. So when I talk about applied digital skills, I think that this curriculum can serve one of two purposes. This can be part of your teaching toolkit where you can use it with students, all or in part. But it also is super powerful because it's a great learning tool for teachers. It could be used by tech coaches or instructional coaches. It could be used just for your own personal learning to get a little bit more into this idea of digital literacy. And a lot of it is connected directly to Google, but there's a lot of tools here that are just good digital sense to begin with. So learn or teach, it can be working as a great tool for both. So a little bit about me. That's kind of my motto all the time is discover, explore, question, and grow. I've struggled with the discover and explore piece a little bit more this year. That's my Twitter at Wicked EdTech. I like to call myself the jack of all trades, master of none, just because I don't know that there's any one thing that I can say that I'm really, really good at this. I'm a little good at everything, I think. And then there's things like that. I'm a science teacher. I teach 2 sections of environmental earth science, which is one of our junior level courses for college prep here at Neuqua Valley High School. And then I spend the rest of my day as the instructional technology coordinator. The links are all live here. I blog, not as much as I used to. I need to get back into that more regularly on the Know Your Why blog. And then I also maintain a website of EdTech resources that focus on 4 C's, digital literacy, curiosity, and a few other things. Like I said, I'm going to throw just about anything out there that I'm interested in, and that's a big part of what I do and why I do these things too. And this is part of my learning process. So I'm looking forward to starting to do more of this again, looking forward to some of the live conferences that are coming up too in the near future. So today's agenda, I'm going to go through the first 2 parts of this and into the third part pretty quickly. Just with the idea that normally if we were together, we'd pause, we would talk, if we were with a large group, but since a lot of us are going to be watching this on demand, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time with discussions or conversations in this. I'm just going to get to the points, kind of work you through this. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more time on exploring the digital skills interface, and then also some resources to learn more, which I've set up for you all that I'll share a little bit later on in this presentation. And that will link out to also with the different resources that are here. So let's get going. So long story short, this is the American Association Library Association, sorry, defines digital literacy in this kind of broad way: the ability to use information communication technologies to find, evaluate, create, and communicate. Okay, requiring both cognitive and technical skills. So it's a blend of those things. I actually do a little bit more with this from my end in the way that I think about it. And I was really highly influenced by this Teach Thought article that you can click on over there on the side. Those, for me, that definition is okay, but I really think it comes down to those skills that have to be part of it. So when I sit down and I think about it, you hear a couple of these words that were in their definition, but it's got to be critical thinking. You got to be a critical thinker when you do this. You got to be curious. If you're not willing to explore, why are you using the internet? There's got to be some kindness and empathy there. We'll hit on that briefly in here. Then there's, of course, communication. There's creating. If you're just consuming and not creating, it's a little bit limited. And then collaboration. That's one of the struggles I know we've all had. My students struggle even being back in class collaborating with each other. They don't understand the concept of a team versus divide and conquer. And that always was a struggle, but it became a little bit more of a struggle after almost a year of not having that regular classroom time together. So we're working on that really hard. And I use these resources kind of in pieces and not all that often. I'll show you one example where we spent a couple of days going through one of these applied digital skills pieces here to build on really our creativity, our collaboration, our communication, and our critical thinking. Those were the ones that I really focused on when I did the activity that I'll share with you guys in a little bit. All right, so a couple quick things here. And if you've been to a lot of conferences, you've seen some of these images and pictures before, but I think it's always good to set our why, what we're thinking about when we're doing this stuff here for those. So what does a classroom for digitally literate students look like? I gotta fix that typo there. All right. In some cases, for a long time, we saw this, whether it was a lab full of desktops or students working individually on laptops. That was the initial trend in a lot of this. We had these computer science labs. We have these ones we don't use here at NECO anymore that were these beautiful tiered computer labs where the teacher was down on the bottom and you could have the projector up at the top and the kids were all facing in the same direction, similar to this. And the idea was, oh, they're going to work on these things individually. Yes, no, maybe. For this one's a big no for me. Then we kind of had to go into this a little bit. I think we were getting better at not using those computers as individual devices. And all of a sudden we got into this pandemic where you were literally looking at yourself and a screen of nobody. Your students' names were there, and that was about it. And I know I struggled last year tremendously with this. My students did too. My own kids did. They're still struggling to get back into that whole school system. Yes, no, maybe? Yes, for me on this one. To me, and this is what the Applied Digital Skills is really designed to do, it is not necessarily you staring at a computer screen. It is not necessarily you working on your own independently, but there's these kind of blended pieces that come together where the teacher's somewhere in the middle of this. You might be working with a group, you might be talking, you might be listening. As students work through paper, as they might work through different devices, so you're not probably expecting a ton of classrooms that have laptops, tablets, and different things like that, but even on their Chromebooks, not everybody has to be on that Chromebook at that given moment as you work your way through the roles and the different tools that are in this Applied Digital Skills curriculum. So that being said, it can't just be about the tools. So if you are just going in Applied Digital Skills to teach them how to use Google Docs or Sheets or Blogger or something else, I don't think we're doing great justice for those. Teaching the tools, which I know was a huge thing in the early days of tech, I don't think that's something that should be our primary focus too often. I see these curriculums still in some school districts where they have all of these benchmarks for learn how to boldface a document. And I understand some of that's important, but most of these resources have gotten so good with the help resources that it's not something as educators we have to spend a ton of time on. If you get into the skills and get into the activity, if the student doesn't know how to do something, that's where you can help them rather than spending a day or two. Here's how this works. And the tools have gotten much better at that over the years, which is what I appreciate about Applied Digital Skills. I'm not going to play this video today. I just wanted to have this in here as a resource, and I'll just talk you through this a little bit, but just in the essence of time and with us not being able to discuss this in any great detail. This was a video that I've used a few times called the Millennial Job Interview. And to be honest with you, it's not very friendly to the young lady that's pictured here. So we use this one. Here's this kind of idea of, one, what digital skills did she bring? Because that's the kind of job she's interviewing for. And then how was she treated as she talked about her perspective and the things that she thought? And it's funny that with this video here, when I've used this in live and virtual sessions before, some people are laughing, some people are just curious. And then I always have a few people that are almost offended by this video because of the way that it treats these people. And I see all of those perspectives in a pretty good way. And if you look at the comments for the video, if you want to take some time to watch this later, you can kind of see how that went there for those types of things. But my idea behind this piece here is that we have to consider not just those technical skills and those content things, but kindness and empathy is part of all of this too. And that's embedded in the background of a lot of these. And it's something that you can build in, and it's something I'm going to show you a little bit here. So I apologize for not showing this video, but I think without having a discussion group, I didn't want to eliminate it, but I think it's something that probably wouldn't do us a lot of value in this format right now. All right. So digital literacy, a little bit more of a definition here, just to go in this a little bit for those. It's about problem solving and creativity for the jobs of the future. Okay. And this piece right here, a lot of students are coming out of here thinking that they have great content skills, but when they get into the workforce, they don't feel that the education system, that's K-12 and probably college and maybe a little bit more focused on college, don't think that they have all the skills they need to enter the workforce. And those skills is something Google figured out. So Google used to have this huge system of going through and what technical skills did you have as a big part of their hiring process. And a few years back, I think this was in 2016 or 17, they went and started looking at some of their better employees and they started interviewing them. And what they discovered is instead of those technical content type tech skills, their best employees were really good at these 7 things. They were good at being a coach, communication and listening, insights, being able to be empathetic, thinking critically, solving problems, and then making connections across different places. And those are the skills that I think schools have gotten much better at doing with our content. But I don't know that all schools and all places have gotten super good at that. They're like, memorize this stuff. We don't do that a ton anymore in my school. I think a lot of schools don't. But if you're not using your content to build these, what they call soft skills, and I don't even know that that's a great term for them, that's what they're called, you're probably not doing your students the justice that they need for the future. So let's get into this a little bit here. I used to say, let's get ready to rumble, content versus skills. I don't think that we have to do that with the Applied Digital Skills curriculum. You can use your content to work on those skills, or you can use those skills to work on your content. It all depends on which way you're looking at it. So here's one of the examples. So I wanted to show you an example of what I did with this before I get into the actual area here. So this is something I did called the water cycle if-then adventure stories. And this is something that you could do outside of the Applied Digital Skills curriculum, but it provides some backup resources that are pretty powerful. So let me open this up. These are the instructions that my students got. And it basically rolled them into the Applied Digital Skills curriculum. And I'll show this to you here in a little bit, but I wanted to get you through the idea here for those. And this was content. This is content that we hadn't spent a bunch of time talking about. So this wasn't a review. This wasn't a summative assessment. The idea was we're going to learn this vocabulary, and this was really a vocabulary activity, as we work on our communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity skills. And when you jump back into here and look at this sample, most of my student samples, they don't last long enough for me to share, so I always keep this one here. This is kind of what we did with this. These tell your own adventure stories, and I'll show you the interface here. That's one of the ones we'll look at when we get into there. Is that idea of, if you've ever read one of those books where you get to the certain page and it says at the bottom, all right, choose to walk down the hallway, go to page 57, or choose to open the window, go to page 42. And then that story changes each time you read through it, depending on which way you go. You're kind of choosing your own adventure. There's some old video games back in the day that used to do this too, that I always used to get a kick out of. So the idea behind this is that you have this ability to create branching forms. So they're learning a skill with Google that a lot of them don't know how to use, is that idea of how to put links into a Google thing like this. So if I'm actually in the presentation here, what you see here is I'm not going through this in the sequence. I could, but what it's designed to do down here is actually give you choices. And each of these choices will take me to a different slide. So if I click on this join the fracking fluid, you're going to see it took me to slide 3. If I go here on this escape one, it took me all the way down to slide 4. So you can build this branching piece to make some connections and use Google Slides in a way to tell a story, not just in a series of step-by-step presentation tools. And you end up with this pretty powerful story that the students can go through. And a big part of it is that critical thinking piece of having to plan out how you do this. I had almost all the kids working on paper first to keep this organized as they tried to make these slides to tell the story of this drop of water. And they had the Google Applied Digital Skills as kind of a background for stuff they didn't know how to do in case I couldn't get over to help them. I'll show you that here in just a minute, as quickly as I wanted to. And that's the great part about this, is I didn't have to teach them every single thing in here. I could help groups who needed it, as other groups were using the Applied Digital Skills to enhance their ability to go through all of this. Quick video here. I'm not going to show this one either here. This is that whole idea of these digital skills where anyone can use them. A lot of these are built for adults. Some are built for students. I'll show you what that interface looks like here in just a little bit. But I just wanted to have this video in there as a resource too.
Before I start these classes,
Sorry. So here's their piece here. And we're always changing this here. And it's actually 165. I thought I changed this, but for some reason I must not have. It's a video curriculum. They have a sampling here of digital skills. This is one of their slides, and sampling life skills. So you can see here how any of these different things are designed to, one, teach you some of those more hard things like coding, graphic design, research skills, but then into some of these soft skills here like organization, planning, okay, and different things like that. And there are currently 165. So forgive me that this number's off here again. I changed this and I must not have changed it. And I must have changed it in my brain or reversed it to 156 for those. Almost every time I go in, like we could go in there in a minute and it could be 166. I just looked at this again yesterday and there were 165. What I love about this is that little part right down there at the bottom though, that I want to emphasize on this slide. The teacher becomes the facilitator. And for me, it's the best way to go and be able to interact with my students in small groups. I can sit with them and just listen, or I can sit and work with them if they're struggling. And it's a great, great tool to do that without me having to feel like I have to teach every piece. You can also do it where you're using this with the whole class. Some teachers I know will show the videos to the class and move through it in a more sequenced way. It all depends on your students and the level of comfort they have with this. All right, so what we're going to do is dive into exploring the lessons here. I'm going to jump over to that here in just a second. Actually, I'm going to jump over right now. And we'll get into the exploring the lessons, and then we'll get into, I don't know that I'm going to do a lot of individual explore time just because of the nature of this webinar, but we'll kind of get into that for all of those. But I'll show you the document that has all the other resources here in just a couple of minutes. All right. Let's get here. So I am just going to do a quick Google search of applied digital skills. And it'll take me to the resource page because I've already been on this a couple times. I'm just going to go to the home page first. I'm going to walk you through for the next probably about 10 minutes, just the interface to show you a couple of key features. And then I'll give a chance to answer some questions and or to give you a chance to explore this a little bit. And then we'll wrap it up at the end here. And I'll get you to that document that I have that has a kind of a sequence of going through and doing this for those. So when you first go to the applied digital skills sheet, you can do all of this without signing in. There are some advantages to signing in. I'll show you that in a little bit, but I'm going to start with not being signed into it with my Google account. So when you look across the top here, this gives you a basic description on this first page here. But these are really the key parts. You've got the teaching part, the learning part, and the browse lessons. So I'm going to go to the start teaching first. And this is where you can learn a little bit more about some of those tools. I don't know if this is where I would start if it's my first time, but I wanted to show you what was here as you look through this. So there's some really powerful pieces in this as you kind of look through this here. So they're going to give you some of their sample popular lessons, and then they're going to break them down for a few other resources. They added remote learning last year. Hopefully that's something that can disappear to a certain extent in the near future. Here's that right if then adventure story. I'll show you that one to you here in just a minute. And you can start right away. There's that video that we looked at before. And you can get started with just a few easy steps. As you work your way down, you can get to this piece right here. And this is the teacher resources one. And this goes through everything. So I didn't create a ton of stuff, although I have a guide to get you to all of this. But if you're a little bit concerned about getting started with this, it goes through everything. A getting started guide, and these are all pretty well done and updated. Remote learning tips, which I hopefully not a lot of us are having to use, and lesson plans and different things like that that it can go through. It has some tutorials down here on getting started. And these tutorials, a lot of these are actually embedded in some of the curriculum. I'll show you that to you in just a minute. And then I like this, it's got some sample student projects. So if you want to get a little idea of some things you can do, create a resume, make art with Google Sheets. I know Eric Kurtz does some incredible stuff with that. There's my right if then adventure story. Infographics, I do that a lot with a variety of things. It's Google Drawings is a nice way. And then down here, there are teacher spotlights where you can go through and look at what different teachers and how they're using it and what they think about it. So there's a ton of great resources just to start exploring before you even do any of this. Now, for me, most of the time, I love this browse lessons part because this inspires me even if I'm not going to use anything. So I'm going to show you kind of how this is broken down. And I'll tell you where I always like to start. I always like to start with collections, which is where it's going to default you to. But if you click on the See All, they put things in different collection groups where you can get a set of lessons that kind of go together for whatever you're going to do. So back to school, we're a little bit past that right now, but maybe you've got an end of the semester project that you're working on, like a capstone or something like that. Okay. And again, not all these are geared towards schools, veterans and transitioning service members. That's a great set Probably not for a lot of us that are teaching high school, middle school, or elementary school for those. College readiness. Okay, learn from anywhere. That was one that kind of got put together recently. I love the digital arts and games. There's some really good stuff in here. Arts and culture. I should probably do a webinar on that because that is become one of my favorite tools in Google over almost anything else. There's so many great resources in there. And that's something that I've not presented on a ton that I probably should start doing that. And then you'll see different collections down here for all different types of things. I used this Earth Day one a little bit last year. Obviously, there's science for me in those types of breakdowns. So those are collections. And when you click on the collection, what it does is it brings you to that grouping of the different lessons. Now, let's say that you look at collections and you're not really sure where to start. If you go back to this browse lessons, you can search for any topic, or there's some great tools here. This is primarily designed for late elementary. My recommendation, if you're a little bit earlier in elementary, is you can still use this, but you're going to use it as a little bit more teacher guided. Like you're going to play the video for the class and then kind of work them through it as opposed to doing that. But you can definitely use it almost through K-12 and obviously for adult learners too. But then if you were looking for something specific, whether it's for you as a personal learner or for your students, you can pick different digital tools. If I click on Docs here, what it's going to do is take me to any of the lessons that are connected to Google Docs. If I wanted to, and if you click on multiples, it'll bring those. So I want to go to Google Drawings. I can see those different tools. So if I was interested in something specific, and then obviously drawings and photos don't sit together very well. So if we take that off, there's only the one photos, one for Google Photos for those. But all of the main Google tools are here, but that's not really all that you have to do with this. So if I close this one up, you also get this topic area. This is similar to the collections, but a little bit more focused on specific topics. So digital citizenship, there's some great tools here as you look at that. And they're always adding to these, like the self-expression one is not one I've ever clicked on before. Let's see what that is. All right, create a personal timeline in Google Drawings. I like that. This one I've seen, introduce yourself in Google, and creating a mind map in Google Drawings. So again, when we click on this browse lessons, you get the entire list of them right here. And if you click start learning now, that's next. This is where you can actually start. Okay, and it goes through some of the different pieces here again in some of those videos and those pieces. If I click on start learning, it's actually going to take me into the curriculum. And I'm just going to show, it's going to have me sign in for this one here, but I should probably go back here and first show you that you don't have to sign in to do any of these lessons. If I'm on this browse lesson page, and let's say I want to do a Google Workspace training because I'm thinking about that, and I'm going to do Docs Part 1, I don't have to sign in to do this. It's all here. And this is what the interface looks like. Each part of it typically gets introduced with a quick video lesson. When you click play on the video,
Google Docs is a cloud-based word processing application that allows you to write, edit, and collaborate.
You will get a short introduction and whatever parts of that project are going to be there. But the parts I really love about all this, just to make sure that you look at these things here, is you can change the playback speed. You want them to slow down a little bit. Maybe you have a student who's an English language learner, or you want to go through it pretty fast because you just want to see what's there and get a preview of it. You can speed it up. You can also just read the transcript. The entire transcript will be right here that it'll go through. And then under the three dots that Google's so famous for, this is where you can turn the captions on and off, or you can download this if you wanted to use this with your class, but not necessarily jump into the curriculum part. And then this little piece right here, picture in picture, which is a newer one this year. You can actually pop this out. I'm not going to do that to add more windows to what we have going on right now. You can actually pop that out, and then you can still see the instructions at the same time that you're watching the video. You can move that video anywhere you want on your screen. They'll also have over on the side here are the instructions, any links that you need. And if there's something to turn in, they'll kind of go through there. And then you just click your way through the next. And I'll show you what it looks like on the teacher end in a little bit here. Another video. In general, it's the same person doing the videos, although each set has different people doing them as you work your way through this. And you can kind of continue to go through. Now, if you ever click up here on the title, you can see the whole list of everything too. So if you need to go back or look at something separate, it's all kind of broken down right here. So if I wanted to move to the end, I can kind of do that. And as I work my way through this, and again, I'm not signed in right now, so I'm not getting any data. This is just being able to use that. And you get all the way to the end. If you want to do any of the things where you turn it into reflections, it's going to ask you to sign in. I'm going to sign in here in just a minute, but let's make sure we're on this whole piece right here. So again, browse lessons, you pick a lesson. Let's do digital arts and games here real quick. You can choose one of those. We've done this one a few times to create an animation in Google Slides. You can see what it's all about. Most of them have a separate set of teaching materials. I sorry, missed that before to show that to you here, which will go through some of the things that you can look at behind the scene. You can even download all the videos if you're worried about bandwidth on a given day. And then again, the whole overview is right here. The other piece I wanted to show you guys, it wasn't in that other one, so I wanted to jump to this one here, is the extensions. I overlooked these the first year or two that I used these. And then all of a sudden I discovered these extensions really provide some extra things that nowadays I usually require the kids to do at least one of the extensions. Okay. And you can look at what those are, and maybe there's one you're going to pick specifically. Now I'm going to sign in so you can see some of the teacher backside of this. And if you're signing in for the first time, it's going to jump you through a few more hoops for permissions and things like that. But I already have an account, a teacher account set up here. The first time through, what it's going to do is ask you if you're a teacher or a student. You can still do these once you sign up for a teacher as a student. I can do any of these lessons that I want and pace myself through them. But here are a couple of my classes here. Sample class, my environmental earth science, and my environmental earth science for my other period here for those. And the only lesson we've done so far this year is write an if then adventure story. I haven't done as much digital this year as I've done in some years past, because to be honest with you, we need a break from it. My students do too. I'll also give you access to this professional development class, and that's the one that I'm going to open up right now to kind of show you the interface, because I don't really need to be posting my student stuff all over the place. That's the one hard thing about presenting this, where I know it's being recorded, is I don't really need my student information out there. So I'm going to jump into this professional development class. This is going to have this series of random names, but I just wanted to show you what the teacher interface looks like. And there's a bunch of those teacher resources that kind of go through this. I'm not going to go too deep into this because I don't want to put a lot of people under there, but I can go to individual people and look, but I can see what's here for each of one. So these are the lessons that I have in this professional development one. And again, this is the first time I've done this year, so we don't have a lot of these in here because I removed some of them from last year. But you can see where people are. You can see what videos watched. You can see if they've submitted something, and you can see the quiz results. And this is a great place for you to kind of take that time to see where your students are at and what they've done and what they've gotten done in those different places for the teacher interface. What I love about this is, well, you can share a code. If you're actually doing this, and we wouldn't do this today, you can actually go and make this work by going through Google Classroom. So if you're using Google Classroom, it's really easy to bring all of your students into Applied Digital Skills class, so they're automatically signed in the first time that they go to whatever link you share with them through Google Classroom to do those. It's super easy to add more lessons in the same way that you would do that to that classroom, and those students will see what those lessons are and what you want to do with them. Now, one of the questions I always get, is there a start one? Google doesn't necessarily say you have to start anywhere. It really depends on what you're interested in. These are all designed to do that, but on the teaching resources page, they do, in this getting started guide, say, oh, all right, if you're not really sure where to start, here's a couple of those ones that you could kind of start with as you work your way through this for those. And these videos are kind of that place here too, like the if then, which is what I'm going to go through here in just a second, has this one right here as you go through it. So I'm going to search for the one that I want, if then, just to show you that this works here, right? An if then adventure story. I'm going to click on open it. And again, on this first page here, here's the activities that it goes through. 2 to 3 hours. If you're going to do this with your curriculum, it takes a little longer than that. I found that's the only area that I've struggled with sometimes, is my estimates on the time, depending on how deep you want to go or there. Focus on docs and slide. There's some collaboration pieces in docs as you go through this. And then these are the skills: digital collaboration, presentation formatting, and slide hyperlinks. It also has a great set of teaching resources, including a sample rubric that I've used a version of, and it'll have an outcome sample here in most cases when you look at this. And you can even do these certificates of completion, where you can throw these out to your students. If that's something that you want to do, you can send them out to your students at any point, or you can print them. And it'll add your students' names to that automatically as you go through this. So if I start this lesson, this is one of the lessons that they say you can start with. He goes over the app overview.
Additionally, you'll learn how to collaborate to tell an interactive story. In an interactive story, the reader acts as the main character and decides.
So if I was teaching maybe younger students, I might play this video to start, and actually for this one, I play this to my whole class to kind of give them an idea what this interface looks like, as the first time we use this, and I show them through it here. And then you just work your way through the series of lessons. And what you'll see here is there is a starter project, which will open up a copy of a story brainstorm. So all of this stuff's built right in here, including turning it in if you want to. I a lot of times have my kids turn it in places where we can all see it. But if you just want to collect stuff from students directly, as you work your way through this, I'll get to one of those pages here where there's a turn in one. I forgot exactly which page that's on, because we didn't do the turn in digital in classroom this last time, because I kind of used it as a backup plan this year. So as you can see, it continues to be different videos. There's some surveys embedded in here and some different pieces. And then here's where you can do this, submit your work on this page view their submitted work on those. So if that students click on this, they have the ability to go in and share their work. They get a little link here that says turn in, and then it becomes part of this. You can also then share those out with your students in a variety of different ways. So that's the basic interface. I hope I didn't go through that too fast. It's definitely worth exploring. What I wanted to get to back in our presentation here. So let's get out of this, back into our presentation. And this would be where we would take some time, but I'm just going to go through this real quick and show you what's here. And then I'll jump in if there are any questions, which I don't see any yet over there. So the other thing that I've put together, well, I think Google did a great job with this. I kind of put together a little bit of a practice for professional development. And if you open up this template, it's hidden up here. I'm just going to use the template then and make an extra copy of it for myself. This was something that I kind of put together to kind of go through this, to kind of give you a pacing guide if it's the first time you want to explore it. So activity 1, exploring the why. I walk you through what some of the stuff I just showed you with the collections. I walk you through where those different stories are that people are talking about. I'd walk you to the teacher prepper resource. So everything I just flew through is all here kind of in order. Sample student projects that I showed you all, some spots to think and add your thoughts, then the options to actually join our PD course if you want to do it from a student perspective and play with it a little bit for those. And then down here, and I want to highlight 2 right at the bottom that are relatively new. Some of the other main pieces that are there that we already talked about and things that I think are good places to start, including here's that 3 starter activities I was talking about that they walked through. And then 2 more recent posts is Eric Kurtz did in Control Achieve a really great overview of the how this works. And then Richard Burns really did the skills that are super important to this. So I thought those were 2 good things to add to the end of this, that even though they're at the end, they're definitely worth exploring as you look at this curriculum and this type of content. So normally we would take probably about 10 or 15 minutes to go through and talk about this. With there not being a lot of us here, not a lot of questions in the chat, I'm going to kind of pause for just about 2 or 3 minutes here. So I'm not going to lie, this wait time is really hard, but I still have a minute. All right, so I'm going to jump back in. If you had a chance to explore, or I didn't give you enough chance to explore, thank you, or I apologize. I just wanted to recap a couple of additional resources, and then just really quickly here at the end, kind of recap how in big picture, I think you can use this in a variety of different ways to help your students both learn a little bit more about different tools, but also learn a little bit more about those skills, what Google called soft skills when they did that report, that I think are really important for all of us. And I think a lot of us have gotten much better doing with our students. So first things first, this very last slide here has a ton of different resources here connected to Grow with Google, which is the bigger piece of this whole thing. So I just wanted, I'm not going to click on all of these, but I wanted to show you what else was here to kind of give you that little piece. So they've added this Grow Stronger to Google within this last year. But basically, they have a ton of different resources here that are connected to really being in the real world. And some of these you saw in the Google Applied Digital Skills, but there's this nice education section down here for those types of things, which includes Applied Digital Skills, which is what we've talked about today, the CS First, which has some great resources for getting kids engaged in that whole coding computer science process, the Expeditions program, which is the virtual augmented field trips and reality pieces that are really cool, and then just the Google Education Training Center that's connected to all that. And there are more programs here too. So that's what's on this last slide is a set of resources. So to wrap this up, I'm going to go back to the very beginning here. I think you can use this to either teach or to learn. It's a great tool for that. Google Applied Digital Skills is built in that type of a way. You can use this as is and let the kids self-pace themselves through it with you as the facilitator and have them just go through it in order. You can use it where you are managing the order and showing the videos and doing different pieces where you have a little bit more of the teacher directed piece, and then the students fill in the gaps for those types of things. Or you can just use a small piece of it. Like I said, we did not this year. The first year we did the If Then Adventure Stories, I had the kids go through every step because I wasn't familiar with it and they weren't either. I've used it now, that resource for what, 3 years now, 4 years now, maybe this is the 4th year. That last year kind of got fuzzy. And it just really show the kids what's there, introduce it to them, and then leave it as a resource. So if I was to go through and look at my student stuff for those, you would see that they skipped a lot of the videos, but you would also see which videos they watched as they looked through the instructions of how to create that type of a if-then adventure story using Google Slides. And the students appreciated that if I wasn't next to them or if they weren't comfortable asking me, they could watch a quick video that went through it, and they could also look at samples. They really appreciated those pieces of it. And I didn't have to create anything extra other than my list of vocabulary words, because I wanted this to be part of my content, you know, instead of just having them tell a creative story without connecting it to my vocabulary. So learn or teach, use it all as one or little small pieces of it. There's definitely some tools here that are worth exploring and taking some time to maybe bring into your classroom to expand that piece. And you don't have to be a tech expert for any of this. Okay, I'm not even sure what a tech expert is anymore. Like I said, I used to think I knew a lot about tech, and now there's way more tech that I don't know. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here if you're watching this on demand or finishing this up now. If you have any questions, let me go back to my contact slide. I appreciate you. I do that too. There's my Twitter. You can also find me on the Neuqua Valley website with my email. You should have probably put my email on the slide, but Twitter is usually the best way to get to me because you can send a direct message. I'm a little bit more engaged there. You can tweet at me directly, which is always nice because sometimes we get other people to chime in. You can also reach me on my blog or on the EdTech resources page that is listed right here. And again, all of the resources are here, including the link to that other document. So thank you for your time today. And hopefully you can do some of the applied digital skills. And if you do, I'd love to hear about it. All right, Brian.
Thanks so much, Steve. Appreciate you joining us today. I do want to pause just a moment here for if any of our live attendees want to throw a question in the chat box. I'll also give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like as well. So I will go ahead and practice some wait time and see if we have any questions. All right. Well, again, Steve, thank you so much. And we love the fact that you were able to wrap up our kind of month-long celebration for digital citizenship resources and things that fall under that category. And the applied digital skills resources have been great today. Look forward to working with you again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.